spending hours alone in her large front room among the phantasms of drowning boys, garrulous southern grandmas, and mean killer prophets, all created within a span of 6 months, Flannery struggled to make sense of her life. When her father died, she had compared God's grace to a bullet in the side. Faced with that same daunting grace, she developed a narrative to explain her situation. For this dedicated writer, there was no surer sign of grace than writing a good story, and she had just written several. So when she broke the news of her lupus to Robert Lowell in March 1953, she swore that, "I can with one eye squinted take it all as a blessing." Spinning her own life as a parable of a prodigal daughter forced home against her wishes and finding a consoling gift, she later encouraged the young novelist Cecil Dawkins. "I stayed away from the time I was 20 until I was 25 with the notion that the life of my writing depended on my staying away. I would certainly have persisted in that delusion had I not got very ill and had to come home. The best of my writing has been done here." This episode on writing, how to harness the mystical and mundane, how to steal from life to craft place and characters, the importance of ferocity in protecting your vision, ideas for crafting a writing routine that remains inviolable for decades, and what to do with all those peacocks in Brad Gooch's biography, Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor. Welcome to Writering, a podcast where we believe that all writers are works in progress. My name is Sarah, and I'm a writer too. I want to get better at this thing that I love, so I'm turning to the people who have done it before. Each episode, I want to share an author's biography or autobiography or memoir with you. They're era, genre, and publication date agnostic. The only thing that matters is that they get deep down into the nitty-gritty of what a particular writer actually does. And, as always, here's the caveat, these are not comprehensive reviews of whatever book we're talking about. A ton of really interesting and fun and insightful and heartbreaking stuff gets left out while I focus on figuring out the stuff of what these authors do when they're authoring. From Kurt Vonnegut's starts and false starts and restarts, to Amy Wise Brown's research practices that taught her to think like her audience, to Agatha Christie's tricks with which she seeded her stories to make them go, to, as we're going deep on today, the way Flannery O'Connor sponged information and rhythms and characters from around her to transmute them into something strange and new. 2 quick pieces of housekeeping before we get going. First, I'm trying this episode out as a video pod. The content's the same, but you'll be able to see my bookshelves and the actual text of the quotes and passages I'm talking about. For our visual processors out there, you can find it in my new feed of @writering, that's all one word, on YouTube. Second, some of you may be familiar with another podcast on the Mangum Talks podcast network, Mangum Reads. It's been languishing for a while, but we are about to bring it back, baby. In addition to book clubbing around various short stories and novels that we've had sitting on our TBR piles, we are also going to spend an episode each month talking about a work from whatever author I'm talking about here this month. How's that for crossover? Our first episode on some Flannery O'Connor short stories will drop in a couple of weeks, so head over and subscribe to Mangum Reads and watch for that in your feed. So, with that said, let's hit the books. As Flannery gradually relaxed, she grew more articulate, explaining in response to the inevitable query about her place in Southern literature. When you're a Southerner and in pursuit of reality, the reality you come up with is going to have a Southern accent. But that's just an accent. It's not the essence of what you're trying to do. That quote comes from Brad Gooch's 2009 biography, Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor. So Gooch has written a bunch of other nonfiction books, including other author biographies, at least one of which, on Frank O'Hara, we're going to do in a later episode. This was a really fun, classic author biography. It goes through Flannery's whole life with a particular emphasis on the physical place from which she was writing at any given point, the influence of her life experiences on her writing, and we are not, within the confines of any of these podcast episodes, interested in thinking about the death of the author, except when the author does in fact die, which might be a joke in poor taste, but here we are. The impact of her Catholic faith on how she understood art and authorship, and the effects of her lupus on the stories she crafted. Plus, this book sometimes feels like a sort of gossipy read on writer friendships and acquaintances. Flannery's early and middle working years were spent at Iowa Writers Workshop and some writer retreats that had like boku talent in the same place at the same time. And there are a ton of tidbits about small-town college life in the war years, the arts in conjunction with anti-communist tendencies, publishing an award drama. We're really only dipping our collective toes in here. And I should note, and I'll talk about it a little bit later in the episode, like part of the inspiration for doing this episode is that I recently saw Ethan Hawke's newish movie about Flannery, Wildcat, and loved it. Here's the TLDR of the book. Flannery O'Connor was born and raised in a Catholic family in the Protestant South, albeit in Savannah, which is like more Catholic, in 1925. An only child, she spent about 15 years in Savannah, going to Catholic schools near her neighborhood. Her family was pretty well-to-do, but her father was in real estate and got hit pretty hard during the Depression. Plus, he was diagnosed with lupus when she was 12, and the disease would claim him when she was 15. His ill health prompted them to move out to Milledgeville, Georgia, where Flannery's mother, Regina, had family they stayed with, and eventually they moved to Andalusia Farm, where Flannery spent the rest of her life. Always creative and artistic, if a little prickly and antisocial, Flannery spent a lot of her time at Georgia State College for Women drawing biting cartoons for the student newspaper, many of which eventually concerned the presence of the Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency services, who about took over the campus in World War II. I mention it because these cartoons paved the way for the satiric bit of her fiction works and honed her sense of character, sparseness, and dialogue. After graduating, she went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop, where she ended up, after realizing she wasn't cut out to be a journalist, and first started really working on her short fiction. She published stories, won a fellowship that allowed her to start on the novel that became Wise Blood, and worked with people like Robert Penn Warren, John Crow Ransom, and Robin McCauley. One of Flannery's main reasons for going to Iowa, and that drove her decision-making after the program, was not going back to Milledgeville if she could help it. So she did a fellowship at the artist community Yaddo in New York, lived with Robert and Sally Fitzgerald in Connecticut for a while, and generally tried to avoid Georgia. But in her late 20s, Flannery was diagnosed with the same lupus that had killed her father, and was forced at that point to return to Andalusia. As we heard in the quote at the top of the episode, it was really that return that made all of the difference for her writing. While she struggled with inflammation, energy and mobility issues, debilitating pain, and brutal treatments, she wrote 2 novels and 31 short stories over the course of her career, including A Good Man is Hard to Find, Everything That Rises Must Converge, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, and Good Country People, all while continuing to travel around the country to give talks on writing, her stories, her faith, the genres she wrote in. She died at age 39 in Milledgeville. And Flannery once wrote, "As for biographies, there won't be any biographies of me because, for only one reason, lives spent between the house and the chicken yard do not make exciting copy." You know, this idea that Flannery didn't live an exciting life makes sense on the surface, sort of, although even that falls apart over the pages of this book. But, her life was circumscribed by cultural norms and expectations of living as a woman in the Deep South during the early to mid-20th century, by her Catholicism, and doubly so by her Catholicism in a Presbyterian South, and her own struggles with her religion, by her disease and quick decline and early death. And yet, here we are. She's taken that confinedness and created a whole wide world with and through it. Not only a worthy subject of a biography, but one necessary of one, even as she moves between the house and the chicken yard. So that's the 50,000-foot view of her life and kind of how this book is laid out. I will say that this episode was not that easy to put together, not because there isn't a lot of great stuff about Flannery's writing in this book. There definitely is. But, and I'll speak on this more specifically a little bit later, but want to hit on it now at the start. She's one of those authors that her contemporaries thought of as having natural talent, and readers ever since have labeled a genius. And let's face it, genius is a hard thing to pull tips and tricks from. But the character who builds in the outside world, who builds the writing and sits down at the desk, is different from the persona. So let's get into the table of contents, the roadmap of what I want to share with you about how Flannery actually put together her stories. Chapter 1 is about family and place invading Flannery's work. Spoiler, all the chapters today are a little bit connected, so see if you agree where I've decided to arbitrarily place the dividing lines. Flannery spent the beginning and end of her life in the South under the shadow of the Civil War and always slightly on the outside with her family because of her Catholicism. The farm, the small towns, the country roads, and the backwoods drive her stories and her characters, which look remarkably like the people she found herself around every day and were mired in these locations. But how exactly did she transmute what she frequently thought of as mundane and stifling reality of her everyday life into the strange and sparse and deeply mystical prose we know her for? Chapter 2 is about patterns and stealing and mirrors. Flannery not only borrowed from Milledgeville and its surrounds and the people of her everyday life, but from other authors, newspaper articles, overheard conversations, you name it. But what made these tidbits her own was the way she wove them in complex patterns of meaning, connecting stories with uncanny resonances, leaving breadcrumbs of hope and faith in the darkness, and revisiting her obsessions again and again. Chapter 3 is about everybody's favorite, routines. Flannery was a stickler for them. Finally, as always, we'll clean up some errata in some favorite passages of mine and close out with an epilogue, some things that I'm ready to try in my own writing based on what we've talked about here today. Chapter 1, Family and Place Invasions. Yet for the writer who claimed, I think you probably collect most of your experiences as a child when you really had nothing else to do, and then transfer it to other situations when you write, her time in Savannah registered as a strong afterimage in her works, especially in the guise of the unnamed 12-year-old girl in A Temple of the Holy Ghost, pacing back and forth in her upstairs room with her hands locked together behind her back and her head thrust forward and an expression fierce and dreamy both on her face. This question of how childhood experiences emerge in our writing and how much we can ever consciously harness them is interesting. Flannery rarely spoke of her child in Savannah and didn't set work there, but it bubbles up, a la Vonnegut's Obsessions, as an afterimage in many of her stories. Stephen King seemed to more consciously evoke his childhood when memories and haunts when writing about children's fears and hopes, evoking the wastelands he and his friends used to tromp around in different forms. But even those have a dreamlike quality to them. So what about you? Do you see the influence of the early steeped-in experience in your work? Do you try to explicitly try to incorporate it? Does it surprise you? I don't know that I've tried to explicitly incorporate it, but it definitely is there. Take, for example, my grandparents' house. My grandfather was an amateur horologist, and so the house was filled to the brim with clocks in various stages of repair, all ticking away day and night. Those may or may not have appeared as a Poe-like murder device in a short story where a wife continues to buy her husband clocks for every occasion over decades of marriage. But now I'm thinking about spending a little more time tracking down some of the sensory flashes that come to me from childhood. So I've been weirdly thinking about the yellowish linoleum that we had in our kitchen when I was really little, eventually replaced several times before my parents moved. I don't even know how old I was. So what would happen or rise to the surface if I just sat with that linoleum for a while? Maybe not a full-blown story, but an ambiance, a vibe, as the kids say. Let's dive into how a couple of these memories, especially around family, bubble up in Flannery's approach to story. A co-conspirator in her world of childhood fantasy, wishing sometimes to be a writer himself, her father slipped her notes signed King of Siam. In their game, she dubbed herself Lord Flannery O'Connor. She would hide little poems or drawings under his breakfast plate or tuck them into his napkin for him to discover when he sat down at the kitchen table. He liked to fold up these tokens of affection, stick them in his wallet, and show them off to friends during the day. So, this is a little outside what I usually talk about, but this kind of early creativity and play points out several things that Gooch, at least, pegs as critical to Flannery's writing life. First is her relationship with her father, who, as I said, would die of lupus, the same disease that would kill Flannery when she was 15. And while her relationship with her mother, Regina, dominated her adult life, and many of her stories saw the indomitable and slightly ridiculous Southern lady grace their pages, the absent father is always also present, as was his legacy for Flannery. Second, the whimsy of the notes and the pen names foreshadows Flannery's positioning of her writing at that border between the mystical and the mundane. And signing her letters off with ever more ludicrous name variations to reflect her mood carried her through to the very end. So here's from a little later, more on her father and how she transformed his absences, even if she rarely actively spoke of him, into her work. O'Connor rarely spoke of her father again. Yet not speaking of him did not imply that she did not feel his loss deeply. She would often keep a discreet silence about subjects that mattered to her the most, beginning with her relationship with her father. Her very silence was a solid marker of its depth. In talking about her personal feelings about God and her religious life, O'Connor, tellingly, once wrote Betty Hester, "I've never spent much time over the bride-bridegroom analogy. For me, perhaps because it began for me in the beginning, it's been more of a father and child." Where many have noticed the dominant place of widows in her fiction, every widow or orphan implies a missing husband or father. So the transmutation of her own family into her fiction was a major theme of the, would we call it a biopic? I don't know, but Wildcat, which was incredible. Go see it. The Ethan Hawke movie, starring Maya Hawke and Laura Linney, blends Flannery's life at the moment her body starts failing and her writing really starts working with scenes from her stories. I bring it up here because the film literalizes this transmutation from life to story with the same actors, including Maya Hawke as Flannery, peopling the short story scenes. Seeing that depiction of Flannery taking the people around her and populating her stories with the translated on screen was super powerful and honestly changed the way that I read this biography and the weight I put to discussions of characters based on so-and-so, which is usually not that interesting to me. The combination of seeing Wildcat with Gooch's convincing way of describing how Flannery germinated her stories from life has me thinking again about that transformation of the everyday into fiction. We first talked about it with Agatha Christie, but the differences here are kind of interesting. Christie had her curiosity box-like collection. Flannery's influences seem more immediate to me, as we'll see a little later on. Part of Flannery's ability to draw so convincingly and even uncannily from life was her own big ears. She spent a lot of her time out among people simply eavesdropping, picking up stories and quirks and cadences of speech. 2 examples. 1, while keeping quiet in class, Flannery had evidently been listening closely to the war stories of classmates like Jim Erickson, at work on a novel about a veteran in a hospital suffering, he told the Cedar Rapids Gazette, from the Oedipus complex. She borrowed from these war-torn heroes for her own more comic anti-hero. And although Iowa City never left many traces in her fiction, the minute she hit Dearborn Station, where Hazel felt a thump of recognition at hearing flat and twangy country voices, her imagination clicked on. 2. Early in the fall, the dry spell finally broke. Flannery had been suffering from increased fatigue, diagnosed as severe anemia, for which she was treated with an iron preparation. She was spending more of her afternoon hours in the waiting room of Dr. Fulgham's office a few blocks from Baldwin County Hospital on the edge of Milledgeville. Here, his cramped 12-by-12 reception room, with chairs set along the walls and dominated by a sunburst wall clock, she began gathering impressions of country types and their small talk that felt like a story to her, about Mrs. Ruby Turpin, one of those country women who just sort of springs to life. You can't hold them down or shut their mouths. She later told Cecil Dawkins of her reward for setting in the doctor's office. Mrs. Turpin I found there last fall. As she stole and transformed stories and characters from her favorite writers, so did she steal them from the places where she found herself spending her days. We'll talk a little later more about Flannery's like open, closed, open writing process. But I think this stage, the gathering of materials and impressions and stuff of the stories, is the key to that first open part. I found myself wondering about this the other day when I was sitting in the waiting room at the dentist's office and thought maybe I could get my impressions and small talk of the mountain folk around me. Then, of course, I found myself absolutely going into like old lady in my day, shaking hand at the sky mode, because everyone was just staring at the phones and at least one good socially distanced chair away from each other. But, then I realized like those are the impressions. What's more true to life at this particular moment in history than like a waiting room full of people inhabiting their private public worlds? Anyway, have big ears and have big eyes. Finally, because Flannery's sense and experience of her own illness was so tied up with her father's death from the same disease, I want to pull a passage here on the impact of the disease and treatment on her writing. Flannery certainly felt this stirring of the cortisone, lying ravaged in an Atlanta hospital bed, her hair having fallen out during high fevers, her face bloated and moon-like from the cortisone. As she later described the mental overstimulation to Betty Hester, I was 5 years writing that book, and up to the last I was sure it was a failure and didn't work. When it was almost finished, I came down with my energy-depriving ailment and began to take cortisone in large doses, and cortisone makes you think night and day until I suppose the mind dies of exhaustion of it if you are not rescued. She imagined a connection between the disease and the novel that she had worked on so strenuously. By a sort of magical thinking propelled by the treatment, the large doses of ACTH send you off a rocket and are scarcely less disagreeable than the disease. She wondered if she had perhaps predicted, even shaped, this illness through her writing. During this time, I was more or less living my life and H. Moats too, and as my disease affected the joints, I conceived the notion that I would eventually become paralyzed and was going blind, and that in the book I had spelled out my own course, or that in the illness I had spelled out the book. That's a long passage, but I want to talk about it, not because I think we should all start, juicing to improve our writing, although really, just what else are we all trying to achieve with all that coffee? But because I think this conscious connection that perhaps only became conscious through her illness, the connection between body, mind, and work is super interesting. So listen again to the way that Flannery is describing that connection. I conceived the notion that I would eventually become paralyzed and was going blind, and that in the book I had spelled out my own course, or that in the illness I had spelled out the book. It's not only a connection, but a mutual shaping, which was itself a breakthrough on a book that Flannery admits earlier in the passage may have otherwise been a failure after 5 years of work. What I want to suggest is that, again, this is not one-for-one advice on how to write, because I don't think most of us are in the market for lupus, but instead I want to encourage myself and you to think about the connections and exchanges between your physical body and the work from the beginning of the process. I suspect that will look different for everyone, but I think in these passages we get a little hidden warning about the dangers of over-intellectualizing the writing rather than knowing it in our bodies too. Chapter 2, Patterns in Stealing and Mirrors. The introduction to this book is entirely focused on a strange little vignette from Flannery's early childhood, one that not only sparks her lifelong obsession with strange and unusual and exotic birds, but also the themes of her work. When Flannery was 4, she had a chicken that walked backwards. I'm honestly a little unclear on the mechanics of this, but whatever. A camera crew came to film it, which didn't go particularly well, but it did lead Flannery to a life of chickens, peacocks, parrots, swans, the more unusual and exotic, the better, and allowed Gooch to write things like, "The girl with the expression she recalled as exhibiting dignified ferocity, recorded in the archival footage in Unique Chicken Goes in Reverse, is instantly recognizable to us. Her features are clearly those discerned in anecdotes about her childhood in Savannah, contrary, a prankster, determined, funny, creative, and focused. And just as her Cochin bantam morphed into a peacock, a bird observed by the old priest in The Displaced Person as taking minute steps backwards, his head spread against the spread tail. So this clever child performer grew into the one-of-a-kind woman writer, going backward toward Bethlehem, who freighted her acidly comic tales with moral and religious messages, running counter to so much trendy literary culture. This backwards and forwardsness, the invasion of the past into the present, the coming and going, is one of the major patterns that Flannery finds herself following throughout her career. We've talked before about authors who harness the power of pattern in their writing. Specifically, Margaret Wise Brown recognized the patterns in the great literature that she loved, as well as the power of repeating stories with a twist and playing in the repetition of language. Flannery loved patterns and repetitions too. For her, they came out in resonances between otherwise unconnected stories. O'Connor loved to play with patterns in her stories. The jalopy that Tom T. Shiflett drives in The Life You Save May Be Your Own looks a lot like that of Hayes Motes, last seen pushed off a cliff in Wise Blood. The big black valise the Bible salesman lugs in Good Country People might be the same one that the three little arsonists carry in A Circle in the Fire. Most poignantly, Judgment Day, a story O'Connor was working on during the last weeks of her life, was a retelling of the first published story, The Geranium, remarkably closing her fictional cycle. The separation between her life and her art was porous. A peacock comes walking off Andalusia onto the farm of the displaced person. In The King of the Birds, she reveals an eye for such patterns in her life as well. The emphasis is hers when she notes a line of pedigree from the unique chicken of her childhood to its artistic descendant, her peacock that will dance forward and backward. Here, Gooch suggests that a part of what makes Flannery's work an oeuvre or a universe that feels not only like it hangs together, but it does so in the realm of the uncanny, is the way she uses repetition and pattern between stories to link them. The way she stages these reoccurrences is reminiscent of the way Vonnegut talked and wrote about his obsessions appearing again and again in some shape or form throughout his works. Here I do think there's something slightly different, though, and an interesting nuance to think about implementing across stories, which is the thingness of this repetition for Flannery. What objects represent our obsessions that we can populate different stories with? Obviously, this feels like something that could be super easily overused. So also, what are the limits of it? The extension of pattern and repetition between stories and two objects seems like a pretty cool object-focused way to create linkages between characters, stories, and worlds. One of the major sources for Flannery's early inspiration was through other authors. While her father had been homebound, she was working on a send-up of Marcel Proust, though she had certainly not read much, if any, of Remembrance of Things Past. In a letter to Marriott Lee in 1956, she admitted that she had only read Swann's Way, the first of the 7 volumes of the French novel. But at 15, she knew enough of Proust's central conceit, the sensation of biting into a Madeleine cookie to release a flood of childhood memories, to write a 4-paragraph burlesque. In writing, as in cartooning, satire was her signature adolescent style. In Recollections of My Future Childhood, she makes fun of Proust as Ogden Nash was making fun in the 1930s of literary greats such as James Joyce in his portrait of the artist as a prematurely old man. Fish oil, not a French pastry, is her narrator's mnemonic choice. It was my first sardine, bruised and blue from crowding. She winds up concluding, Proust wanted pastime, I'll take any old time. Flannery was an eclectic reader, poring over whatever was around, and spending most of her childhood doing mostly unsolicited reports and reviews on whatever she read. But beyond that, we have here again, in her focus on Proust and the Madeleine, an interesting fixation on memory, how it works, what triggers it, and what might be simmering beneath the surface. Plus some thoughts again on how one might access it. Pair this with the questions we asked earlier about Flannery's latent Savannah-ness and how to get it into your writing on purpose, or if you even can. And I'm like bulk ordering sardines and madeleines from Amazon just on the off chance. Maybe my unlock, though, is actually tuna noodle casserole or a garden fresh tomato, whatever's going to bring up that exact pattern of the yellow linoleum I told you about. Anyway, I do think there's a lesson here about copying and satirizing style as an exercise as well. Part of the critical legacy around Flannery is obsessed with tracing who she was like mimicking at any given point in time. But the reality is that it's only through making a conscious effort to satirize all of these authors that she got exposure to the way that they made their stories and voices go, which meant that she could then magpie pick from those tools to craft her own voice and themes and all the other stuff. Perhaps unsurprisingly, she was obsessed with Poe as a teen. We'll come back to him in an upcoming episode. Here's another discussion of how Flannery mined other authors for ideas. O'Connor later developed a selective memory about what she had read and when. When I went to Iowa, I had never heard of Faulkner, Kafka, Joyce, much less read them, she later claimed to a friend. Yet her early stories bear traces of the fingerprints of both Faulkner and Joyce. And the Story Survey, her textbook for her English 311 course with her name M.F. O'Connor and address 305 West Green Street, Milledgeville, carefully inscribed on the front page, has a checkmark in the table of contents next to Faulkner's That Evening Sun, a star next to Joyce's A Little Cloud, and lots of underlining on of the explanation of Gothic in the write-up on Poe's Cask of Amontillado. She was obviously mining authors for ideas for her own experiments in writing and for kindred sensibilities. In her final public lecture, The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South in 1963, Flannery said, "The things we see, hear, smell, and touch affect us long before we believe anything at all. The South impresses its image on the Southern writer from the moment he is able to distinguish one sound from another. He takes it in through his ears and hears it again in his own voice, and by the time he is able to use his imagination for fiction, he finds that his senses respond irrevocably to a certain reality. The Southern writer's greatest tie with the South is through his ears." Here we get, and particularly if you can imagine it, in Flannery's flat Georgia drawl, a resonance with Vonnegut's advice to try just being where you're from, especially through tone and style. He once said or wrote, and I don't think we talked about this last episode, but I love it as a writer and as fellow Midwesterner. "I myself grew up in Indianapolis, where common speech sounds like a bandsaw cutting galvanized tin, and employs a vocabulary as unornamental as a monkey wrench." There are several points in this book where Gooch dwells on how Flannery chose to write, the words and phrases she used, the blowback she received for them, and her response in the aftermath. To be honest, there were like a couple of passages that I wanted to talk about but shied away from because of the language and the kind of sticky question of whether to read the word out loud or censor it, a question we struggled with in like all of my lit classes and even in my teaching too. But the overarching point of those moments was that Flannery's response when questioned on why her characters talked like they did and why they couldn't use more acceptable words was that the people she grew up with and modeled her characters after wouldn't have spoken like that. The Southern writer's greatest tie with the South is through his ear, and I think that holds wherever you're from too. And that's not to say that it's easy all the time, right? Flannery struggled with how her Black characters talked, for example, and has some deeply questionable comments on racial matters, and she admitted repeatedly that that was a challenge for her. But harnessing that where you're fromness of your ear is a skill to hone, and like honestly a cheat code for creating real urgent dialogue and thus real urgent characters. For this trickster's tale, when she sent to her agent in October, Flannery used names that could be found in the local phone book. H.T. Shiflett lived on Route 1. Lucy Nell Smith had attended her Wise Blood book party. But as she began to describe the widow Lucy Nell Carter and her nearly 30-year-old mute daughter, also Lucy Nell Carter, visited by the one-armed handyman Tom T. Shiflett, she found herself writing, too, about the grounds of Andalusia as reflected in the purposely distorting mirror of her imagination. The old woman and her daughter were sitting on their porch when Mr. Shiflett came up their road for the first time. The old woman slid to the edge of her chair and leaned forward, shading her eyes from the piercing sunset with her hand. The daughter could not see far in front of her and continued to play with her fingers. Flannery borrowed from whatever she could get her hands on, as evidenced in this passage, both from the landscape and from the phone book. The thing I'm most interested in this discussion about that collecting and transfiguring from the real world to the fictional world is the details, the names coming from phone books and guest lists and the particular glare of the light on the farm. And as Flannery borrowed from life, using her big ears to eavesdrop on the conversations and particulars of the people around her, and borrowed from other authors, she also scoured the newspaper for inspiration, and I love this so much. Conceiving a good man is hard to find, she connected the dots of a few articles that mesmerized or tickled her. The Atlanta Constitution reported on a petty bank robber with the alias the Misfit. She clipped a photograph of a tartly made-up little girl in tutu, incongruously mimicking Bessie Smith's rendition of A Good Man is Hard to Find at a talent contest. And going back to characters for a moment, Flannery received from the lost, often amoral characters of this living Catholic novelist, Mauriac, the same thrilling permission she received theologically from the Thomist definition of art in Maritain's Art and Scholasticism as a habit of the particle intellect, rather than a speculative or moral activity, the territory of the theologians and saints. As Maritain concluded, the pure artist, considered in the abstract as such, is something completely unmoral. The job of the Christian writer, understood in this 13th century way, was pure dedication to craft, to telling strong stories, even if they involved atheists, hoodlums, or prostitutes. The same craft lifted up by O'Connor's new critic teachers. As she would later spell out this enabling notion in folksier language to Betsy Hester, you don't have to be good to write well. Much to be thankful for. So I've got to admit that I don't always fully understand Gooch's explanations of Flannery's faith, the theology that influenced her, and that which she disagreed with, let alone how these notions and beliefs influenced her understanding of her role as writer and artist. I'm not a Catholic, and the theological nuances are right over my head. What is important to me, though, is that Flannery's Catholicism was really the bedrock on which her foundations as an artist were built, and she struggled with the relationship between her identity of faith and the things and people she was compelled to write about. And this borrowing of the phrase, a habit of the practical intellect, which I messed up earlier, seems useful in thinking about how Flannery herself was able to square writing about the holy and the profane, and to step away from writing morality tales, as her mother would have thought of them, with nice people, to put the craft above everything. In a more mundane, or at least less theological bent, this idea of the highest calling of a writer being dedication to craft, that is fulfilling your purpose as a writer, with the result that with craft in mind, you can write about whatever you want, so long as you do it with respect for the art, is ultimately freeing. Much to be thankful for, indeed. And I think that this understanding of her place as an artist informed Flannery's ability to commit to her artistic vision, even as she was plagued by the ungenerous responses of real and imagined readers, and mired in the slog of proceeding sentence by sentence, crafting until it was right, and still managing to rewrite everything over and over again, as we'll talk about later again too. Here's how she talked about some of those anxieties. In January 1960, Flannery O'Connor was invited back to the college as a local literary celebrity to speak at chapel in Russell Auditorium. Her topic was some aspects of the grotesque in Southern fiction, but she added personal comments that she left out when giving the same talk some months later at Macon College. These thoughts, tailored to her GSCW audience, suggested insecurities that had haunted her ever since college. She confided that morning, "When I sit down to write, a monstrous reader looms up who sits down beside me and continually mutters, 'I don't get it, I don't see it, I don't want it.' Some writers can ignore this presence, but I have never learned how." I mean, encouraging to know that we're not alone, but some advice maybe would have been nice. That said, Perhaps Flannery's fervor comes precisely from that inability to ignore the least generous reader. God knows she had enough of them. And to continue to write what you know you've been put here to write. From another point in the book, emboldened by having Lowell on her side, she wrote back to Selby of her choice to take the high road of art, responding to his sense of a limiting kind of aloneness in the book, as if you were writing out of the small world of your own experience. I am not writing a conventional novel, and I think that the quality of the novel I will write will derive precisely from the peculiarity for aloneness, if you will, of the experience I write from. So, many of the writers we talk about struggle with criticism and self-confidence and doubt, and I don't mean to suggest that this passage means that Flannery didn't. We know she did. We've got the receipts. We just talked about them. And yet, at the same time, her letters and talks and the memories of others also piece together like a masterclass in confidence in the face of that doubt. A confidence almost verging on arrogance to some of her interlocutors, but one that demonstrates that Flannery knew her project, knew the people she wanted to write about, and while she took criticism and advice from people she trusted, her faith in the project itself was secure. And while we've strayed a bit from patterns and mirrors and stealing here, I can certainly learn something from that. Chapter 3, Routines. When we were in the 3rd grade, Sister Consulate used to give Mary Flannery a real hard time about her composition, recalled a classmate who lived a few doors down at 302 East Charlton Street. She said that she always wrote about ducks and chickens, and she said she never wanted to read about another duck or a chicken. Obsessions start early, I guess. But they don't always get you very far in the beginning. From a little later on, in December 1941, the Peabody Palladium picked up the story of her spoiled attempts to find a publisher for these books, all about her geese, in a piece titled "Peabodyite Reveals Strange Hobby." The interviewer asked, "Mary Flannery, what's your hobby?" She replied, collecting rejection slips. "What?" the confused reporter responded. "Publisher's rejection slips," she explained. Flannery and Stephen King out here both nailing rejection slips to the wall. But another thing that started early for Flannery was the powerful combination of needing feedback, reading aloud, and constant rewriting. O'Connor sometimes led a friend or two upstairs in the family house to her secret attic, a 3rd floor kept for guests. In a remote bathroom, she liked to sit back in a large bathtub supported on porcelain feet, disconnected from any plumbing, and have her friends read aloud from her latest works. Sister Jude Walsh, a former principal of St. Vincent's, tells of Margaret Pickney, a child with a flair for performance who went along with Mary Flannery's wishes as they sat together in the dry tub. But then Marguerite would get miffed because in the middle of a paragraph, Mary Flannery would say, "Stop right there. Would you read that over again?" I guess even then she was attuned to how something was expressed. Marguerite would be annoyed because she saw no reason to stop the flow of the story. Like I said, this is a habit Flannery kept through all her writing career, reading aloud to make sure the sound of the thing was right. We'll get to some other passages around it later, but this obsession with the right word is important. Predating, but whatever, Kurt Vonnegut's son's remembrances of his father in his office, reading and rereading and muttering out loud over pages for rhythm and authenticity of dialogue and the mot juste. Flannery was also writing people from a particular place, in addition to wanting to capture her own voice. The reading aloud was a crucial part of nailing the phrasing that would marry character and place, and the reading aloud by someone else was, while it sounds deeply uncomfortable to me, a way to detach a bit from her own work and hear it through different eyes, as it were. It's also worth noting and thinking about, although it may not be specifically useful in our practices, how much reading aloud was part of the writing world Flannery was a part of. Students read their works to the seminar every week at Iowa Writers Workshop, and a lot of Flannery's career in writing included travels to read and lecture, revising constantly along the way. Even when stories were published, in Flannery's case, they weren't finished. Part of that was because of her constant need to make things better, to just get the phrasing just right, but a lot of that was driven by anxiety too, as we talked about in the last chapter. Okay, on to the actual nuts and bolts of her routines. Paul Horgan's advice to the girl, he did indeed later remember as a sort of waif in the art of writing, was to set aside a number of hours daily for writing. Same time, same place. That habit became her lifelong regimen, the very soul of her artistic credo. She later shared her discipline with a young writer in 1957. I write only about 2 hours every day because that's all the energy I have, but I don't let anything interfere with those 2 hours, at the same time and the same place. Something goes on that makes it easier when it does come well. And the fact is, if you don't sit there every day, the day it would come, well, you won't be sitting there. Okay, I know that we're simultaneously all obsessed with writers' routines and that, set aside a consistent time and place to write every day isn't exactly groundbreaking advice, although it's a good reminder and one that we get several times over the course of this book. But like I mentioned up at the top of the episode, one of the tough things of doing this episode is that so many people around Flannery talked about her in terms like born writer, genius, natural talent, what have you. And that can be really discouraging when you aren't that and are trying to figure out what an author does to make their writing and their practice go. Plus, it's rarely true, as evidenced by this type of schedule. Flannery was brilliant, but she put in the work to be a genius, and she did it every day. Gooch takes pains, and I certainly thank him for it, to give us Flannery's schedule at the various places she inhabited, from Connecticut to Andalusia and beyond. The overall structure is remarkably similar, showing her discipline and dedication to the ritual of the thing, but there are variations around the actual writing that I think are equally as interesting. Here's the schedule with the Fitzgeralds in Connecticut. Each morning, Flannery and one of the Fitzgeralds drove to Low Mass at Sacred Heart Church in Georgetown, 4 miles away, while the other parent stayed behind. Upon returning, Flannery boiled herself a breakfast egg and lingered at the kitchen table, with high chairs pushed up to it, until Robert left for his commute to Sarah Lawrence College in Westchester. Flannery then disappeared up the interior back stairs to put in 4 hours of writing, which I find is the maximum, she wrote Betty Boyd. At noon, dressed in a sweater, blue jeans, and loafers, looking slender and almost tall, she reappeared with a daily letter to her mother, posted by walking a half-mile to the mailbox at the bottom of the hill. After an hour or so of lackluster babysitting for the Fitzgerald kids, and when Robert returned from teaching, the 3 adults recreated some of the mood of Yaddo by mixing a pitcher of martinis, sharing a meal, gossiping, and discussing books. And then, when she was back at Andalusia, she soon had in place a narrow bed with a high Victorian headboard pushed against one tall front window. A few steps away, she positioned a writing desk smack onto the back of an armoire, turned away from 2 corner windows, her attention focused inward rather than on any pastoral views. As Regina busied herself with driving about the property in her stick-shift automobile, inspecting fencing or planning a livestock pond at the bottom of the hill, her daughter stayed in her room, shades drawn, having reinstated an inviolable regimen of writing for several hours in the morning. Yet during her first season at Andalusia, most of this writing consisted of rewriting. Although she felt that her novel was essentially finished, the publication process was full of stops and starts, beginning with a long, silent spell that made the first-time author nervous. More on rewriting later, but first, 2 final notes on Flannery's routine. Again at Andalusia, certainly by early 1953, Flannery had settled into a schedule and rhythm that remained unvaried for the rest of her life. The woman who came to believe that routine is a condition of survival guarded her daily regimen with the help of her mother and a self-protective instinct, but also with contentment and joy. As she implied to the Gussets, each day followed a pattern, beginning with her mother up first, waiting with a thermos of coffee for the 2 of them to drink at the kitchen table while listening to the local weather report on the radio. This cycle of hours and days had a religious significance for Flannery, too. As Thomas Merton, a self-described 14th century man, abandoned New York City for the life of prayer and farming of a contemplative monk in Kentucky, so Flannery, dubbing herself a 13th century Catholic at Yaddo and at Andalusia a hermit novelist, framed her new life in religion. Immediately upon waking, she read the prayers for Prime, prescribed for 6 a.m, from her 1949 edition of A Short Breviary. Following coffee, she and her mother then drove into town to attend Mass at Sacred Heart, celebrated most weekday mornings at 7. The priest for a decade was the charming, bridge-playing Father Toomey from Augusta. Flannery sat in the fifth pew on the right side, recalled one parishioner. Not merely a personal peculiarity, regularity was a civic virtue too. Flannery was surrounded by family and friends who arranged their lives like clockwork. Regina was a stickler, and Flannery could could chafe at her rules and regulations, but as long as her own writing time and space were kept sacred of her writing desk, she said to a friend, "Nobody lays a hand on that boy." She could accept other impositions. And, okay, finally, a note on what comes in the immediate aftermath of the regimen. Yet Flannery was adept at shutting herself away during her set time between 9 and noon when she applied herself to her writing. Averaging 3 pages a day, she told a reporter from the Atlanta newspaper, "But I may tear it all to pieces the next day." While modest, her desk began to take on the character of a folk sculpture constructed of random parts, utilitarian to her eyes alone. "I have a large, ugly brown desk, one of those that the typewriter sits in a depression in the middle of, and on either side are drawers," she wrote, producing a mental snapshot of the assemblage for a friend. "In front, I have a mahogany orange crate with the bottom knocked out and a cartridge shell box that I have set up there to lend height and hold papers and whatnot, and all my paraphernalia around this vital center, and a little rooting produces it, besides which I always seize on busy work." Okay. I normally try not to stick quite so much text right in a row, but I do think the piling on of these discussions of Flannery's routine, which constitutes by no means all of the descriptions in the book, is in itself pretty instructive. There are a couple of threads I want to tug on here. First, as we've talked about a little already, is the inviolability of the routine itself. The maximum hours that she sets change a little bit throughout her life, from 4 in the good years to 2 later on as her energy waned. But it was always in the morning, always after some sort of spiritual practice, and always alone. And I mean alone to the extent that, if at all possible, she wasn't even looking out the windows. I love that as much as it generally seems that Flannery's mother, Regina, didn't really understand or even like her writing, she was increasingly instrumental in protecting that sacred time and space for her. Shout out support systems. The other thing about the aloneness, from being in a room or garret of her own to moving the furniture around to block out all distractions, is that it gives us another flavor of Stephen King's write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open idea. Remember, that's the idea that first drafts should be written with just you in the work with the door closed. It's for you, it gives you freedom, and you don't have to worry about that ungenerous reader that Flannery talked about. Rewriting with the door open means approaching the work through the eyes of your ideal reader. Not all readers, God help you, the ideal reader. For Flannery, the door closed was literal and apparently as cave-like as she could get it, which bears out when you Google pictures of her writing desk. But what I also want to talk about, and this bears out in some other passages we've discussed here, is that to me, Flannery has a very clear open-closed open process. And maybe that's not so unusual either, but Gooch takes pains in this book to discuss Flannery's Vonnegut-esque big ears, as we talked about, to take inspiration in characters from the world around her, even if it's a waiting room in a country doctor's office. There's something to the extremes between open and closed Flannery seems to go through that has an alchemical effect on her writing, transforming and retransforming as if being pushed through a filter before being allowed to collect more material and being distilled again. And on the note of extremes, I want to return to the religiosity brought to her routine as well. Positing herself as a 13th century Catholic writer and a hermit novelist both rings true from what we've learned about her life, her faith, and her writing process. But I also wonder if there's a little bit of fake it till you make it going on there too. As in, perhaps Flannery tapped into the power of playing these characters when she was steeped in her routine and sat down to write, trying on identities that made it easier for her to get steeped into that ritual and sit down to write. I know I sometimes imagine myself like into a role as a stylish, slightly harassed literary persona when I start to edit. What's your writing character? Finally, and to end this section off, there's another stream of tidbits in this book that are not so much Flannery's routine as her like habits and peculiarities as a writer. One of these is her absolute refusal to outline. She is very much not a plotter. Here's what she had to say about it. Any author who follows a hard and fast outline allows himself to become a slave to the typewriter. To that I say, yes, Flannery, that's because it feels easier than whatever it is you do. Cut to a scene of other non-outline people, i.e. pantsers, revolting. But she really doubled down on the idea, having, quote, defined her type of writer as decidedly non-formulaic. I don't have my novel outlined, and I have to write to discover what I'm doing. Like the old lady, I don't know so well what I think until I see what I say, then I have to say it over again. And this actually bore out in her writing. If Flannery is to be believed, and why shouldn't she be, in Good Country People, she didn't know Manly Pointer would steal Hulga's leg until like 10 or 12 lines before it happened. And she loved when that happened, saying, when I found out it was going to happen, I realized it was inevitable. This is a story that produces a shock for the reader, and I think one reason is that it produced a shock for the writer. Okay, that is a pretty good reason for like not following an outline to the letter, I guess. It does allow for an element of genuine, actual surprise. In addition to being of the pantser ilk, Flannery was a basher. Robert Lowell confirmed how Flannery wrote in his Guggenheim recommendation, providing the description of her process as sentence by sentence at snail's pace. But part of that pace was Flannery being conscious of her own needs as a writer, particularly when she was working on novels. Here's a passage on determining what's sustainable in writing and discovering the difference between a short story and a longer work. Meanwhile, upstairs, the pile of yellow second sheets on which Flannery was composing her novel was mounting. She was making progress, thinning out and pacing the opening. Well, I can't sustain that, she told Sally when her friend praised The Train. I have to tone it down. According to Sally Fitzgerald, she did husband her energies. She knew she had much work to do, and she knew she had to do it alone. Errata. We've got a real eclectic mix of extras this time around. First, a taste of the Yaddo artists community. Like the Iowa Writers Workshop, Yaddo had recently been hosting a Southern Renaissance. Catherine Ann Porter shared a chicken dinner with her fellow guest Eudora Welty and had the dubious pleasure of finding Carson McCullers stretched across her doorway in the main mansion professing undying love as she simply stepped over her admirer on the way to dinner. Porter was so taken with the place that she soon bought South Hill Farm nearby. During the summer of 1946, Truman Capote was ensconced in Katerina Trask's uppermost tower room with its ornate Gothic tracery windows, writing his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms. Following Capote's suggestion to apply for a Yaddo Fellowship, the Texas-born Patricia Highsmith had arrived in mid-May, coinciding with O'Connor's stay for 6 weeks to work on her own first novel, Strangers on a Train. So, in addition to being one of those like murderer's rows of authors working and staying at Yaddo, I always love hearing about like who is in the same place with whom when and the unexpected connections forged there. We have gotten advice from other authors, I'm looking at you, Stephen King, warning us away from writers' retreats, the pressure to produce, the unreality of it all, the forced work and socialization. But Flannery is the other side of that coin. She thrived during her time at Yaddo until they started hosting mock trials of the owner for communism. This was a very confused and frankly unhinged episode in the book, as I suppose anti-communist fury rooting out and convictions by ad hoc collections of writers would be. In any case, I think it's worth thinking about why something like a writer's retreat or even a program like Iowa might be so attractive to someone like Flannery over someone like Stephen King. First, there was a large contingent of her family clamoring for her to do something useful like teaching, an idea Flannery found abhorrent. And In the absence of a sensible career that would make use of her education, there was always the option to return to the farm Andalusia in Milledgeville, which Flannery eventually did on account of her debilitating lupus, but which was stifling and isolating. And while she was not yet so completely cut off from the world as she would later be, which is also a little misleading because she conducted like myriad friendships and relationships through letters throughout her later illness and confinement, Flannery didn't already have the literary acquaintances that would sustain her or the personality to independently forge them. She needed the space, the time, and the company afforded by these programs, so much so that she would work for her keep, cleaning or babysitting, in order to stay longer. Not all of us have a Tabitha King working to hold down the ship and lift us up in the hard times. Okay, but next bit of errata. But rereading the revised draft in mid-September felt to the novice writer rather like spending the day eating a horse blanket. So she asked Mrs. Tate if she would mind taking yet another look. Emboldened by the request, Gordon typed back a staccato 9-page single-spaced list of suggested edits. Jammed into these tight lines was a crash course in the basics of her fictional creed. Henry James advising a stout stake around which the action would swirl, the practice of Flaubert to never repeat the same word on one page, Yeats's recommendation to offset every tense line with a numb line. Listen, it's not Flannery's writing advice, but it's a bumper crop of tips from other people, so I'll take it. Next, I've got a new line for parties. When asked why she was sitting alone in a corner, she replied, "Well, I'm antisocial." And finally, I just love the story of how she came to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. When she finally spoke, her Georgia dialect sounded so thick to his Midwestern ear that he asked her to repeat her question. Embarrassed by an inability a second time to understand, Ingle handed her a pad to write what she had said. So, in schoolgirl script, she put down 3 short lines. "My name is Flannery O'Connor. I am not a journalist. Can I come to the Writers' Workshop?" Epilogue. Y'all, we made it to the end again. There's a way in which this episode was really all about drawing from life. At once thought of as both circumscribed in her experience and larger than life in her writerly persona, Flannery is such an interesting study in what it means to craft transcendent stories when the bounds of your life are more finite than you might think. I've totally got a massive book of Flannery's letters on my TBR pile, and I'm excited to get more of her voice. Coming out of this episode, I'm most invigorated by some of these like real nuts and bolts ideas of collecting stories and concrete tidbits and deep-held memories from life. Somehow Vonnegut's big ears make more sense to me in the context of how Flannery sourced for the stuff of her writing. I'd like to spend a little less time on my phone when I'm out and about, and a little more time paying attention to the people around me who may or may not be on their phones. And who knows, I might find myself in some newspaper archives sometime soon. I'd love to hear what you're going to try, and if you've got recommendations for other author biographies or memoirs to mine for writerly advice, you can find me on X at SarahBethGW and Instagram at Sarah George Waterfield, both in the show notes. Also in the show notes are a link to Brad Gooch's Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor, and other podcasts on the Mangum Talks podcast network. And speaking of other podcasts on the network, don't forget to check out our reintroduction episode of Mangum Reads, where we'll discuss a couple of Flannery O'Connor's short stories. That episode will drop in a couple of weeks. All right, y'all, it's been real. Go write something. Bye.